Welcome to week 4 of our course. I look forward to working with you during this week. This week we will be focusing on the Industrial Revolution and the rise of nationalism in Europe, focusing on the 19th century or the 1800s. You have 3 assignments to complete for this week. First, you're asked to participate in a discussion board. The discussion board focuses on the rise of nationalism in Europe and the significance of nationalism in European history. Next, you're asked to complete a primary source assignment. You'll be reading testimony related to industrial conditions in Britain in the 19th century and how harsh labor conditions were at that time. And then finally, you're asked to view a film that's a little less than an hour in length about the Industrial Revolution in Britain and write a commentary related to this film. In terms of nationalism is the idea that a particular ethnic or national group should control their own political destiny. Nationalists argue that a group rooted in ethnicity, history, and common language should have their own nation, their own state, and control their political system or destiny. Nationalism emerged in Europe for the first time really during the reign of Napoleon. Prior to Napoleon, most states in Europe were not nation-states in the modern sense of that term. The most common type of state in Europe prior to the Napoleonic era was the multinational empire. An example of that would be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had 11 different ethnic or national groups, all of whom spoke different languages and had different cultures and traditions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire included what today would be Austria, Hungary, parts of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, parts of Italy, and all of these individuals resided in a single state. What defined the state was the ruling family. This was the land that the Habsburg family ruled. The state was not defined by a common language, a common ethnicity, a common religion. Another example of this would be the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was quite vast in the 18th century and encompassed people of many different nationalities. It included what today would be the states of Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Poland. And again, the people of the Russian Empire did not share a common language or culture or ethnicity. Nationalism would act to break apart these multinational empires. With nationalism, peoples demanded independence from these multinational states. So in the 19th century, the 1800s, you start to see ethnic and national groups rising up in rebellion, seeking independence. There was a great wave of rebellions in Central and Eastern Europe in 1848. And in this wave of rebellions, each national group, for example, the Czechs and the Hungarians and the Slovaks, they each wanted independence to establish their own nation-state. So one impact that the force of nationalism had was that it led to the breakup of multinational empires in the long run. Nationalism could also serve as a unifying force, interestingly. Another type of state that existed prior to the age of Napoleon was the small city-state. In Germany, there were 38 separate states in what today would be Germany. Germany didn't exist as a unified nation until 1871. Prior to 1871, Germany was 38 separate small states. And each of these states The people were German. They spoke the German language, and they shared somewhat of a common culture. In this case, nationalism led to calls for unification. When Germans rose up in rebellion in 1848, they demanded the creation of a unified Germany and the end to the 38 separate small states. The same was true in the Italian peninsula. Italy did not exist as a unified nation until the 1860s. Italy was divided into at least 9 separate states. And ultimately, again, rebellions in Italy would move Italy towards unification. So nationalism led to the breakup of large multi-ethnic empires, and it led to the unification of smaller states into nations. The other topic that we're exploring this week is the Industrial Revolution. People have made goods for thousands of years, long before the rise of industry. During the medieval period, before the Industrial Revolution, people made a variety of goods: clothing, shoes, tools, carriages, weapons, goods made of iron. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, goods were made on a small scale in small workshops by artisans or craftsmen with hand tools. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, goods were made with simple hand tools. The only source of power was the power of human or animal muscle. So the blacksmith would heat iron in a fire and then hammer it into a horseshoe shape, and then plunge it in water and allow it to cool and harden. This production was small in scale because it was done by hand. You couldn't produce a mass amount of goods through this technique. This all begins to change in the mid-18th century. In the mid-18th century, new inventions emerge in Great Britain, or England, that allow humans to harness steam power, and later on you see also the emergence of electrical power. With the rise of steam power and later electrical power, suddenly machines became possible, and new machines were invented by the mid-18th century to exploit steam power. By the 1750s, you had the invention of the spinning jenny and the power loom, which radically transformed the textile or clothing industry. Suddenly, machines could produce vast amounts of cloth and clothing. Soon other industries were transformed by machines powered by steam power initially. By the mid-19th century, the mid-1800s, the production of goods was radically transformed, first across England, then across Europe, and then other parts of the world as well. Suddenly, huge quantities of goods could be produced, quantities of goods that could never before be imagined. And the workers now were not primarily artisans working in small shops. With the rise of industry, you see the emergence of the large-scale factory. In the factories would house the machinery, the factories would produce steam power, and the factories would bring together hundreds or even thousands of workers in some cases. Workers now essentially tended to the machines and had to keep pace with the pace of the machines. Unfortunately, labor conditions in the early factories in Britain and then other countries were very poor. There were no labor laws in 18th or early 19th century Britain. There was no minimum wage, there were no maximum hours that one could work, there were no regulations related to child labor, there was no inspection of factory for safety conditions, and as a result, the conditions were often quite terrible for workers. wasn't uncommon for individuals to work 15, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week in the factories, which left very little time for anything else other than sleep. It wasn't uncommon to have 5 or 6-year-old children working long hours in the factories, sometimes at rather dangerous jobs working near the machinery. Injuries were very common both for child and adult workers. Losing fingers in the machine was a common occurrence. There was no workers' compensation, so if you were injured, you were simply fired. There was no compensation and you couldn't sue your employer. So the conditions were pretty abysmal in the 18th century and early 19th century in factories in Britain and then later across Europe. So these are the two primary topics we're looking at this week: the rise of the force of nationalism, the sense of ethnic identity, and the idea that each ethnicity should have a separate state. And then secondly, the rise of industry and how this transformed the lives of workers. I hope this will be an interesting unit for you. I look forward to working with you during this week. Thank you.